last week, or 2 weeks ago rather, we looked at some myths and stereotypes surrounding the partitioning of Africa. Those of you who joined us 2 weeks ago, and we looked at some examples of African resistance. So those of you who were here the last 2 weeks at that session, and perhaps those of you who were not, I'd like you to brainstorm amongst ourselves as to what you consider some of the ramifications of colonial rule on Africa and Africans were. And I'd really like to stress that if you do contribute via the mic, speak for only 20 seconds so that everybody gets an opportunity, or use the chat to answer this question. I really want you to be focused and think about what you consider some of the ramifications, the consequences that colonial rule had on Africa. You can be very broad or very specific. So over to you. You should have like about 5 minutes or so on this question. So a brainstorm is quickly some ideas that come immediately to your mind, drop it in the chat or put your hand up, and Nigel will identify you.
Yeah.
I did want to write it on my screen, but I don't think I can. So I'll have to follow the chat. Let me see.
If you stop share, then I'll be able to see everyone.
Okay, let me stop share. Great.
Whoever puts their hand up and wants to speak.
Great. Okay.
Please do
loss
so
of
now.
land, that's a great one. Loss of land, very succinct. I like that. Definitely loss of land. Absolutely. And loss of land was access to a livelihood. Yes. Any other important ramifications, consequences? Division of ethnic groups. Excellent. Yes. Erosion of institutions. Brilliant. We're going to be looking at that. I'm going to be expanding on that point too. Destruction of culture, yes. Dehumanization of Africans.
Sammy,
yeah,
please
renaming Lake Victoria, and we had African names, for these names. I remember when I was in Zimbabwe in 1994, and going to Lake Victoria. On both sides, Zambia and Zimbabwe, and their African names for the so-called lakes. Excellent. Inferiority complex, loss of cultural heritage, change of language. Fantastic. I saw somebody's hand go up, which has disappeared on my screen. Intergenerational trauma, yes. Identity loss.
It was Sammy. He was trying to get in, but we kind of didn't give him an opening. Sammy, this is your time. Jump in quick, sir.
Sorry. I was gonna say the redrawing of ethnic linguistic based kingdoms that now cross between nations because of colonial borders that were established. So basically there are ethnic and ethno-linguistic groups in separated by borders.
Absolutely, Sammy. The image that comes to mind, or the case study comes to mind, is Senegal is a country that has the Gambia in the middle of it, like a finger projecting into Senegal, which is 30 kilometers long and a few miles wide. That is the Gambia. And yet the people on either side of those borders, Mandinka people all speak Wolof, as well as other ethnic groups. But this is part of the absurdity of colonialism. The French took Senegal, as we know, and the British hang on to Bathurst, and eventually it became the Gambia. We've had lots of fantastic responses in the chat that I can see. Yes, impunity, violence, rape, theft, pillage of land, destabilization and destruction of families. Fantastic. That's brilliant. So yes, I'm going to share my screen with you, and you will see some of your points echoed on my slide. Okay. Okay. Yeah, some impacts of colonial rule. I've not presented them in any order of priority. The loss of political sovereignty, the undermining of indigenous political systems. People have mentioned new territorial borders and boundaries, the creation of artificial states. Many of you have mentioned that in terms of the violence as well. The death, the destruction, the murder, rape, plunder, and pillage that created these new territorial borders, ethnic and language divisions that were being mentioned, an exacerbation as well of ethnic differences, the imposition, that is, Africans having thrust upon them economies of extraction for European benefits, which then led to number 5, deindustrialization, and consequently we have dislocated economies in the post-independence period. And then again, to echo what some of you said, this is a term that I've used, schizoid personalities, which is me referring to or paraphrasing Frantz Fanon and his Black Skins in White Masks, his book and his writings, in which we have Africans who are, stripped of their culture and who have, a reverence, aspirations to be European in their culture and their identification in terms of their aspirations. And therefore, as the great Ngugi wa Thiong'o would say, there's a necessity as a result of this black skin, white mass to decolonize the mind. Let me come back to the issue of ethnic and language divisions, again, to draw on Ngugi. In his Decolonizing the Mind, he emphasizes in that book how one of the very disastrous impacts of colonial rule through Christian missionary educations was that these mission schools that were set up by Europeans enforced upon the minority of Africans who were so-called privileged, part of the minority to get a Christian or Western education, that they were taught the European language. And what this meant was, and Ngugi says in this book, that they had to speak English in the school. And if they were caught speaking in Ngugi, it was Kikuyu. If they were found speaking Kikuyu, they would be punished by caning. They would be whipped. And then they would be forced to wear around their necks a placard which stated, "I am a donkey." So this is the extent to which the British colonial powers in Kenya inculcated within a minority of Kenyans who went to the mission schools, the elevation, the superiority of the British language and British culture, and inculcated in them a sense of shame to speak Kikuyu. And that shame allowed the British to get away with, to use a term one of you used, impunity. But also to instill in Africans, a sense of alienation and inferiority complex and disdain for their own culture. So this is an example of the ethnic and language divisions that was a specific impact of colonial rule, no less catastrophic in terms of its impact than the other impacts that we've all identified. Now let us move on. In terms of by way of introduction, by 1900, the partition of Africa was virtually over, with the exception of 2 countries in Africa that were not colonized by the Europeans, Liberia in West Africa and Ethiopia. And colonial rule lasted from the 1880s, 1884, when the Berlin Conference took place, up until 1960. 1960, was a critical year in which at least 17 African countries became independent in a mushrooming of African countries attaining their independence. And it was, pioneered by Ghana under Nkrumah in 1957. Now, as brief, the brevity of colonialism, was short, only 80 years, but its impact was very profound. And Basil Davidson, he puts it very succinctly by saying that colonial rule was a time of profound upheaval for all of Africa's people. It brought irreversible changes. Nothing would ever be the same, end of quote. And essentially, by the 1900s, all the independent states of Africa, communities, big and small states, whether led by the Tukulu or Ashanti or the Zulus in South Africa, Dahomey, all over Africa, African people, empires, kingdoms had been brutally crushed by the various European powers. And to really understand the impact of this upheaval, we have to understand that African peoples and societies, they were in possession of their own cultures, their own systems of governance. They had their own ways of living together. They had their own ways of resolving conflict and imposing social order. And the political scientist, Ethiopian, I think, Berihun Gebai, he points out in his book and his work that there were three types of political systems during the pre-colonial era. That is the era before Europeans ventured onto the African continent. There were centralized administrative systems or centralized states, such as Ashanti, the Zulu, the Tukulus, Samori Toure in present-day Guinea. And there were also stateless societies that really functioned on the basis of lineage, that is family clans. And an example of this is the Somalis in the Horn of Africa. And the last type of political system that existed were very small communities. Again, they were based on kingship. And some example of these small communities are for the Tiv of Nigeria, the Igbo of Nigeria as well. And he points out that all these three different types of political systems, they had different types of political organization in terms of how power was arranged in the society. And this power, otherwise known as constitutions, was essentially about customs or norms, deciding how political organization and decision-making should be made within the society. And essentially these customs were basically traditional governments in Africa. And we've got to understand that these norms, these ways of doing things they evolved. They occurred over, centuries. For example, the Ghana Empire, ancient Ghana existed as far back as the 8th century. So over centuries, Africans, evolved, devised their own systems of doing things. And essentially customs can be defined as a way of life, as a law, as a practice, as a constitution, which is not written down, anywhere. It is something that is intangible. And for Europeans, African customs and traditions were perceived to be problematic. And according to Gebier, these three different types of communities and states were characterized by custom as a constitution in pre-colonial Africa provided the fundamental rules of organization of society, the government structures, and the rights and duties of individuals and groups. However, as I've said, the Europeans found African customs or constitutions difficult or problematic rather, because for Europeans, the hallmark of civilization was writing. And when they came to Africa, and in many parts of Africa, there were no systems of writing. In some societies, there were, having been influenced by Arabic and Arabic writing systems. But for Europeans, they denigrated African forms of constitutions, African ways of organizing power. And they considered Africans to be backward and to be inferior. And they considered African government structures to be, the term that they used was tribal, and tribal was a pejorative term, and tribes was considered to be pejorative, meaning a tribe, meaning backwards, stuck in time, failing to evolve, failing to become modern. So when the Europeans ventured into Africa, they completely ignored, marginalized the constitutional setup, the customs that Africans had for centuries practiced. And whilst they did this, on the other hand, being very contradictory, what the colonial rulers did was they also incorporated, invented, and also accommodated themselves based on the ground, what they found on the ground. They accommodated some of the traditional government systems that existed in Africa. There's not enough time for us to look in depth into these pre-colonial African constitutions and setups. But if you are particularly interested, the author Gebier, who I've mentioned so far, he has a chapter 2, The Transformation of African Constitutionalism, which is one of the required readings for those of you doing the course. And that is part of the independent study that you're being asked to read in your own time. But in short, Gebier points out that in all of these different types of communities that I've outlined, whether they were centralized states or empires such as Ghana or Mali, or whether they were small communities, he argues that genealogical ties and connections played a very crucial role in the foundation and development of political power in these societies. And more importantly, in these various types of societies, there were checks and balances. These checks and balances in these traditional systems were very important to minimize, to reduce the rise of despotic rulers. That is, rulers, who would become dictators. That's not to say that, Africa did not have its own, dictatorial, tyrants. We should not romanticize the African past. But in centralized states, for example, the king or the chief was considered to be the custodian of political power. He was symbolic of power. And he was bestowed with, the powers of making laws, that is legislation, carrying out execution of laws and regulations, and also adjudicating, that is deciding when there is conflict within the community, being an adjudicator. But it's also important to emphasize or to remember that in pre-colonial African societies, that the king or the ruler, the chief, they did not rule unilaterally. They did not rule alone. They could not impose their way on the people, on the village or the clan or the family, because in these societies, power was shared. The king had a king's council or a chief's council, and he could not simply dictate or execute laws and policies without consulting his elders or the queen mother or village head, or ritual functionaries like priests. So the point I'm making is that, and Gebier is making in his work, is that pre-colonial African societies had the term that we would use now is that there was some level of democracy, consultation, participation, people being involved in the decision-making in the society. And these processes of checks and balances in order to mitigate against, unilateral or autocratic rule, existed in kingdoms such as the Buganda, the Luba, Zulu, and so forth that I've listed here. And it was important. It's important for us to realize that even the kings, you know, at the pinnacle of the society, who've been invested with so much power, political and spiritual authority, they too could be destooled. That is, through the process of checks and balances, they could be removed from the throne. That is what destoolment means. And there are examples of the Ashanti, where 3 kings were destooled. Osai Kwame in 1799, because he absented and failed to perform his religious duties during one of the religious festivals. The King Kari in 1874, he also was overthrown or destooled for what was considered by the elders to be extravagance. And Mensa Bonsu in 1833, he was again overthrown, destooled for excessive taxation of the community. So these are very clear examples of, you know, African systems of fairness and checks and balances to curb the powers of kings. So we should not, the point I want to make is we should not think of kings in pre-colonial African society or traditional rulers as being autocrats in any way. So how was power, okay, I can't read, sorry. How was power ascribed in pre-colonial African societies? It was structured in the way, as I've said, the king was at the pinnacle of this society, but yet beneath the king, there was a layer of provincial governors or chiefs in various provinces or villages. And these provincial chiefs, or what they call small chiefs, smaller chiefs, under the subordination in terms of deference, you know, hierarchy, the provincial chiefs, they had autonomy of action within their jurisdictions, within their small village or their province. And this is, you know, very important to appreciate. And Gabay shows in his chapter that colonial constitutions dissolved the indigenous constitutional systems by transforming and reconfiguring the traditional governments and customs into the colonial constitutional systems through acts of rejection, accommodation, and invention. Now, this is important for us to understand. To put it differently, what Gebier is saying is that the colonial constitutions, they did away with, sometimes they did away with the indigenous constitutional systems, and sometimes they were pragmatic in that they saw these pre-colonial systems as useful. They were convenient as vehicles through which the European powers could rule through them. So sometimes they did not reject, they did not do away with the traditional systems, the African traditional systems. And sometimes they invented, they imposed their own chiefs, their own rulers on the ground where they saw it necessary to do so. And this alludes to what they did in the case of Nigeria, an example that I will be giving later in this lecture. But to move on, Professor Edubuahin, he argues that by 1910, the colonial system had been imposed on all of Africa. It had been set up on the majority of African people. And he also points out that the first 2 decades of the 20th century saw the gradual imposition of colonial rule, colonial systems. And some of the generic features of colonial rule, whether it was the French, the British, the Portuguese, or even the Spanish, even tiny little Spain had control over Equatorial Guinea. or the Portuguese. Well, all the European powers did was that they appointed governors and officials to rule over African people. And these governors or these colonial systems were not accountable to African people, but accountable to the metropolitan power, that is, accountable to Paris, accountable to London. They were accountable to their own metropolitan European colonial powers. So after the so-called brutal putting down or brutal subjugation of Africa, which is otherwise referred to in the colonial literature as pacification, the colonialists set themselves two tasks. And according to Basil Davidson, the first task was to transform military occupation into civilian methods of rule. That is essentially the colonial powers, they could not rule through violence and force continuously. No colonial power can do that. There's only, there's only so much in terms of violence, tortures. Violence and torture is only sustainable for a certain period of time. It cannot be long term. So therefore you need to find other ways to rule, to keep your hegemony, your domination over a people. The second task of colonialism was to find new and more rewarding ways of drawing profit from the colonies. So these were the two objectives of the colonialists. So let's look at each of these tasks in a little bit more detail in terms of transforming military occupation and what it involved. Michael Crowder, another historian, he points out that in many respects, the military conquests of the African states proved to be a simpler job for the technologically advanced Europeans than the actual organization and consolidation of effective colonial rule. End of quote. To put it differently, what Michael Crowder is saying is that, military conquests, military subjugation, that is putting down, placing your boot on the neck of an oppressed people, is a very easy task. And Europeans were able to do this because they had a military advantage in the technology, the Maxim guns that they had. But what was more difficult, what was more challenging and proved very difficult for the Europeans was how to sustain colonial rule, how to consolidate effective colonial rule. That is what Michael Crowder is saying. So the fundamental issue for the European powers was how to maintain their domination, and particularly over huge swathes, huge areas of territory with uncompliant, rebellious, revolting, that is subjects who were revolting, rebelling against them. And this proved to be very troubling. This proved to be not an easy thing to do, as the Europeans, thought or conceived. Basically, colonial rule was not easy, despite the colonialists, seeking to brag, to boast that they were the colonial powers and rule Britannia. Britannia rules the waves. Britain never shall be slaves. That was one of the colonial songs that British colonialists and British people would sing. In terms of this national pride and racial arrogance as well. But the colonial administration that had to be imposed involved the following things. Appointment of, that is, selection of European colonial governors in the territory, setting up of a European-led colonial administration, comprising, that was made up of regional and provincial officers. And there would also be district officers, who worked in public works such as health and education. So these were some of the aspects of colonial administration. And we have to again appreciate that this European bureaucracy or apparatus, this colonial administration, was a minority. To give you a sense of the, Europeans in Africa, in 1938, for example, in Nigeria, 40 million Nigerians, that was the population of Nigeria at the time, they were governed by some 380 British political officials and a further 1,163 in other departments. So 40 million Nigerians governed by the small minority of Europeans. And these British officials had to work through, or had to work with, rather, it should read, they had to work in cooperation, in partnership with a number of African interpreters, who were paid, who were part of the colonial apparatus, African policemen too, because the natives had to be policed, local chiefs who were appointed or selected by the colonial government, and an African army that was made up of African soldiers who provided the rank and file of colonial armies. And the echelons, the top echelons, the generals, the sergeants were, of course, the Europeans who were the commanding officers. So all these individuals, all these parties made up the colonial bureaucracy, the colonial apparatus. And sometimes these African interpreters or policemen, chiefs, they were lower minions. Some people may dub them to be so-called puppets or collaborators. That's a term that we may use today. And certainly we can say that these minions, these lower level Africans who participated in this colonial bureaucracy, some of them abused their position, by taking bribes, by bullying, or by advancing their own personal interests, their own vested interests in the system. So to look at it another way, colonialism, the colonial systems not only undermined African indigenous pre-colonial systems, but it also gave rise to repression and to corruption in addition. Are there any questions or brief comments at this stage? I'm just very, very quickly.
Yeah, please feel free to raise your virtual hand and come off mute when called.
No, can I move on?
We have one.
Okay, go ahead.
Just a very quick one. I had two like nowadays parallels came to my mind when you talked about the Ashanti king who was destooled for excessive taxation. It reminds me of the current protests here in Kenya, the Ruto must go protest that also started like from, rejection of higher taxes. And another one, and maybe you can, I don't know if you can elaborate on it later on, the fact that you said that military rule at some point has to be replaced by like a more civilian rule because force can't be maintained. And I'm wondering what you think about the military rule in West African states at the moment, where the military rule doesn't really seem to be based on violence, but kind of on an agreement with the societies, with the people that are being governed.
Okay, Betty, thank you for your questions and comments. Both your questions do take us off point, really, in terms of focus of today's lecture. But certainly the protests by Kenyans today in the country, are a response to any political system, regardless of whether it's colonialism or it's our own governments. That is, the people have voted into power, these people. If a people, a nation, consider the policies, the treatment, the failure to deliver, austerity, cost of living crisis, having to pay to use, the internet. I was reading, internet charges in Kenya was just one of the issues that young people or people generally in Kenya are outraged about. Here in the UK, just last week, after 14 years of a repressive Tory government, they've voted in Labour. So there's been change. So the point I'm making is wherever there is domination, a sense of social and economic injustice, the flip side to that will be revolt or resistance by the people to seek justice, social economic justice. As for the political coups and the return of soldiers from the barracks into the echelons of power, that's a topic I cannot speak on right now. It takes us really off track. But yes, it's worrying, I see. It's troubling because the last 4 decades of Africa's history, the soldiers have not done much better than the civilian rulers. So we're going round in circles. Yeah, we're going round in circles. I don't think it's a good thing necessarily. I'll stop at that point. Okay, I'm going to move on because there's a lot to get through. So why were European colonial administrations, why were they small in number? I gave you the statistics there of 1938, 40 million people in Nigeria. There were 380 officials and about 1,163 other Europeans. Europeans in Africa believed or had this mentality that the colony had to pay for itself, and the colony should not be a burden on European taxpayers. Essentially, the European governments, did not want the running of a colony to fall upon European taxpayers. To put it another way, colonial rule had to pay for itself. And therefore, Africans were taxed through introduction of the cash crop economy. This was something completely new to Africans. The whole introduction of money, a money system, a monetized system was brought to Africa, where they had to work in order to get wages, in order then for part of those wages to go into the coffers of a colonial administration to pay the salaries of Europeans and those African soldiers and interpreters. This was a system that was a disruption, a violence that was imposed on African people, this cash crop economy, whereby Africans had to work, in cocoa plantations, cotton, in the diamond mines, gold mines, etc. And as Basil Davidson puts it very eloquently, quote, very few Africans had asked for colonial rule, but all Africans had to pay for it, whether they liked it or not. However, the Europeans impose, this taxation system, and there are many examples apart from these that I've listed here on this slide of the poll tax being imposed in Sierra Leone, which was opposed by Bure of the Hemni people in northern Sierra Leone, and he led his people in guerrilla tactics to rebel against the imposition of the poll tax by the British. Similar in South Africa, Bambata, the leader of the peoples in South Africa in 1906, also rebelled against the imposition of taxes there. Now, in regards to the second task of colonial administrations, it was to exploit the colonies for the rich economic resources that they possessed. And this gave rise to a political economy of extraction, which was to be detrimental to African people and African societies, because Africans then became dependent on these single crops, whether it was cocoa or cotton or gold, they became dependent on what became known as a monocrop economy for foreign exchange, that is in the post-independence period. And when these cash crops exacted low prices on the world market, it led to economic underdevelopment, lack of financial resources to create or to construct roads, houses, buildings, electricity, and to diversify the economy. So in this political economy of extraction, Africans were forced to grow cash crops, as I've pointed out, and some examples are listed here on this slide. Cotton in Egypt and Uganda, rubber, as we know, the very famous, I'm sure most of you are aware of the rubber. Even before rubber in the Congo, it was ivory that the Congolese were forced to extract at a very high price. For not doing so was to have their hands amputated. Clothes all over Africa, the riches in the minerals and the agricultural resources were looted for the benefit of the colonial power. And part of this, socio-economic injustice of colonialism was that the colonial powers gave priority or preference to their own firms. Expatriate firms were given preferential treatment to import manufactured goods, from Europe to the African colonies. These raw materials of cotton or cocoa were then finished as goods in Europe and then resold to the domestic market in the colonies. And these companies, whether it was Unilever or many others, they all had the backing of their respective governments, and they also controlled the prices of these agricultural and mineral resources. And the consequences of their control was that it led to the exclusion of Africans from the import and export business sector. Africans were discriminated against, in the granting of loans from these expatriate-owned banks. Africans were excluded from the diamond, the gold, the manganese companies or timber companies that existed right across the continent. And overall, this political economy of colonialism was characterized by the gross neglect, the gross deindustrialization of African societies. Manufacturing took place in Europe to the detriment of African societies and people. And this is one of the consequences that African societies, African nation states are, living with. One of the many legacies that African societies and people are living with to this day in the post-independent period. Now, what I want to do now is to focus on some of the major differences between the French and the British colonial systems of administration. And first of all, I'll look at, some of the things that they shared in common. Now, some of the things that all the colonial administrations, whether they were French, Portuguese, British, they were all concerned with law and order. And this is law and order in order that there was stability, that, colonial extraction, economic plunder could take place. So therefore, each colonial power had a colonial army that was made up of Africans. So that was a first similarity that they shared. Another similarity is, as I've said, the taxation, that the colonies had to pay for itself. And this was in order not to incur a debt that was to be, paid by European people. And another similarity of the colonial powers is that, as I've mentioned, that their armies were made up of Africans at the lower echelons, and the commanding structures were usually, white generals, in short. The French colonial administration had some general characteristics that were quite distinct, different from the British. The French in West Africa decided to join their West African territories into a single federation known as French West Africa, or Afrique Occidentale Française, AOF. This was because they wanted, and you will see this hopefully graphically, those of you doing the course, you will see this in the assignment that is set for this week. The assignment is to watch the film called African Apocalypse about the French in French West Africa and how they sought to join up their colonies in French West Africa. And this idea of joining up the colonies in French West Africa, Senegal, Mali, Sudan, Gabon, this was to make it easier to control, to link their territories in this region of the African continent. Now, one of the major differences between the French and the British in terms of their colonial policy was, unlike the British, the French advocated principles or values that they coined into a policy of assimilation. And it was very similar to the Portuguese, who used the term evoluer. I'm not sure whether I've pronounced it correctly in Portuguese, but assimilation or evolved had very similar ideological orientations in terms of philosophy or outlooks. And I want to throw it out there. Does anybody know the meaning of assimilation or evolved? What was the intention? What do you think? What do you know of assimilation? What do you understand by assimilation or évoluer? Do I need to stop sharing my screen in order to get some contributions?
Yes, please. Oh, we have a hand though.
Okay, go ahead.
Ade?
Okay, good evening. For me, I wanted to talk on assimilation, and assimilation was majorly to, assimilation was majorly to turn the African colonies into French people in terms of the language, the cultural practices, all that. Yeah, that's.
Thank you for your contributions. Anybody else want to contribute? Go ahead.
I think if I remember correctly, it also came with like the idea that at some point people from the colonies could join the French parliament and kind of become French and like kind of join this identity of being French and yeah, joining the center from the peripheries kind of.
Yes, yes, good. Last person and then we'll press on. Is that Anitha?
Yeah.
Awuku?
So just basically like how everybody else has said, but also that nuance where even though there's going to be that erasure of what would be the African culture to assimilate it into the wider colonial culture, it's also a question of, once that happens, to see the African culture as lesser in the periphery and have the colonial culture as the culture to aspire to.
Excellent, all three of you. You've really succinctly, in a few words, captured what these policies of évoluer or evolution, we'll say, or to be evolved, assimilation. These policies try to make African people, and it's a tiny minority of African people who were exposed to these European cultures. It wasn't the masses, the majority, who were often in, you know, the rural areas, the villages. It was those who were exposed in the Christian missionary schools to Christianity, and also to education, that is European education. These policies tried to make the people of the colonies into French and Portuguese Black men and women, to Europeanize them, to instill in them the aspirations to become French, to become Portuguese, and to despise and to look down upon, to denigrate their own culture, their own languages, their own practices, and to imitate to French or Portuguese language, dress, etiquette, and values. And those who were considered to be assimilated, you know, or evolved people, they were, as I think one of you said, they were nominally given or granted French citizenship or Portuguese citizenship. But yet, even despite being granted French citizenship, like the people in Paris were part of the French parliamentary system, despite being given this designated status, they still continued to experience racism, racial discrimination, you know, in the metropole. So assimilation or evolution, that is blending in, integrating, alienating themselves and despising their own culture, and, you know, looking up to, wanting to become French in their etiquette and in their mannerisms, was essentially the colonial policy that assumed the French believed as a colonial power that what was good for the French people was also good for the colonies or colonial people. And so therefore, this led the French to consider their colonies to be France outre-mer, that is overseas France. The French saw their colonies as an extension, as part of a greater France. And that idea, that mentality extended after the formal independence or after flag independence. That policy of France outre-mer became Franc Afrique, a policy that some colonial independent powers after colonialism bought into. Here I'm thinking of Houphouët-Boigny of Côte d'Ivoire and Mobutu Sese Seko. They all bought into, you know, their aspirations to be close to France. So this was the policy of the French colonial territories and the French mindset, which dominated how they ran their colonial territories as an extension of France. But in terms of structure, the French ruled their colonial territories with the Governor General of Dakar in Senegal, who controlled the federation. And unlike the British, the French Governor General took orders from Paris. And unlike the British, the Governor General in Dakar, he had no legislative authority. That is, he took all the laws, he was dictated to by Paris. Control, laws, what to do was dictated to him, and he had to carry it out. And again, local government was also modeled on France, whereby, you know, whole areas of French West Africa was divided into localities. Just give me 2 seconds to plug in my laptop before I'm cut out. Great. Okay. So yes, the French colonial system had a governor, and it was very hierarchical. and the governor took orders from Paris. He could not make laws. Local government too was also modeled on France, whereby the French colonial territory had a governor on top, and then the territory was divided into localities, or the French would say circles. And each circle was administered by a commandant de cercle, or a commander of the locality. So there was again a devolution of power control. And the locality was again subdivided into subdivisions controlled by a French local official. So that's the general structure or setup in the French colonies. Another important characteristic of the French in their territories was that in the French colonial territories, all colonial subjects were forced to do labor, to work for very miserly wages. Corvée is the French term. And this forced labor was used to build roads. And these roads were important, were critical. They were the arteries, the transportation arteries that were critical to bring in whether it was the groundnuts or the agricultural produce from the hinterland, that is the interior of the colony, to the shore, to the coast of Africa, to then be put on ships to be taken to France. So building roads was very important in terms of infrastructure to the colonial project. And if one looks at a map of Africa during colonial rule from 1880 to 1960, you will see that all the roads, or the very few roads that were built, the major roads, all link from the interior, the hinterland of Africa to the coast. That is, the roads are a reflection of the rape, the hemorrhaging, the looting, the pillaging, the plunder, taking out the resources from, you know, the heart of Africa or the interior of Africa directly to the coast, where these resources are then put on the ships to be transported back to the metropole. And this system of corvée, you know, forced labor, was very much hated by African people, was very much resented by African people in terms of the hard labor, the sheer discrimination that it entailed. Now, okay, before we go on to that, so yes, in terms of corvée, I've spoke about, it was much resented by the African people. And in a nutshell, the French colonial apparatus, the impacts of the French colonial administration was that it essentially led to the breakup, the dismantling of the large African states that had originally existed in these territories. States like Dahomey, the Tukulor Empire, the Empire of Samori Touré, the states in the Fouta Djallon, states in Dahomey and Benin. They were all undermined by French colonial rule. Let us move on now and look at some characteristics of British colonial territory. And yeah, British colonial territory, I'm going to kind of focus largely on British West Africa, Britain's colonies in the Gambia, Nigeria, the Gold Coast, and yeah, Sierra Leone. But of course, Britain had territories elsewhere on the African continent in terms of North and South, so-called Rhodesia, Zambia and Zimbabwe, South Africa, Kenya, Uganda. And there are certainly similarities in how Britain ruled West Africa and East Africa as well. However, in East Africa, in Kenya and in Zambia, Zimbabwe and South Africa, they were peculiar or in the fact that they had settlers, white settlers, British settlers, who had carved out and sought to create an enclave. They sought to bring Little England to Kenya, Little England to Northern Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia, and South Africa. And yeah, the nature of settler colonialism was slightly different. But that aside, in British West Africa, each territory was governed by a governor general. And as I said, unlike the French, the governor general possessed legislative or lawmaking powers. That is, the governor general not only listened to the British government back here in London, but the governor general in each of the territories had what was called a legislative assembly. That is the ability to make laws there and then on the spot in the colony. And this legislative assembly advised the governor general in enacting laws, that is laws for peace, order and good, as determined, of course, by the governor general. And this legislative assembly was advisory, as I've pointed out. It was made up of government officials, some British businessmen, and a tiny minority who were selected, who were nominated by the governor of Africans. So for example, in 1916 in the Gold Coast, Nana Sir Ofori Atta I, he was king of the Achem people. The Achem people had a kingdom going as far back as the 13th century. But in 1916, the British allowed Nana Atta Ofori I to become a member of the Legislative Council. And by his title, Nana Sir Ofori Atta, you can see that he was very compliant and had a pat on the back by the British. So he was knighted. He was given the title of Sir, because he was considered to be a good African. So yes, he became a member of the Legislative Assembly in 1916 in the Gold Coast. A chief, a king who was championing his people. And there are many examples too across in British West Africa of a minority of kings being permitted to be part of the Legislative Assembly. The Executive Council that also existed in the British territories was entirely made up of, it was only made up of British officials and British senior officials. And in the French territory, there was no such thing as an Executive Council. The French colonial apparatus, as I've said, was highly hierarchical and very dictatorial. In terms of British colonial administration and in contrast to the French, because the British Colonial Office in London had appointed a Governor General on the spot in the colonial territory on the continent, this allowed governors some considerable freedom of action, some room for maneuver. That's not to say that they were not responsible. They did not have to consult with the British Colonial Office in London. But as I've pointed out, each colony, had these structures of the council, the executive council, and a legislative council. But in terms of local government administration, similar to the French, the British ruled through African chiefs. And that's simply because there was not enough British administrators, to be placed on the ground. But the British used the chiefs slightly differently from the French. And what the British introduced was a system known as indirect rule. And so here I want to ask, does anybody know what indirect rule is? How did it operate? Have you heard of the term indirect rule? Any hands going up? Yes, no?
Yusuf? Obi? Yeah.
From how I understand it, indirect rule is more that a certain degree of the local governance structure is kind of left in place, but then there's a cooperation between the, for example, the British higher authorities and then the local authorities, like for example in the north of Nigeria, where I think it's like until today that certain structures have kept in place, while the south of Nigeria was more under direct rule, which meant that the British appointed people that ruled quite down to the local level.
Good. Yeah, thank you, Bertie. Anybody else?
Yusuf, go ahead.
Okay, for me, indirect rule in typical in Nigeria, British Nigeria, it's a situation where the British colonial administrator rule the people with their existing traditional chiefs. Okay, when I say existing traditional chief, I mean those chiefs that are protecting the interests of the British. The British made it a point that those chiefs that are ruling the kingdom are protecting the British interests. And in the case of Lagos, it was said that some kings who were not protecting the British interests were dethroned, and several examples like that. And in the northern part of Nigeria, it was also like that. The emirs were made to rule, and the governor general were in charge. They were just more like they are a British puppet in power. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Biney Baraka? Baraka, you with us?
Yes, hi. Yeah, so in the case of indirect rule, it allowed for certain leadership to stay in place, and that allowed for cultural preservation. And in some cases, it aided in helping with resilience. Yes, I feel what was said earlier about in the cases of Nigeria, like the leaders were used to achieve the goals of the British, but in certain cases, especially in northern Nigeria, because the leadership in place was slightly stronger than it was in the southern side of a part of Nigeria, it allowed for the northerners to be able to have more of a resilience to fight colonialism. So indirect rule in the case of Nigeria really had different impacts on the different sides of the country. So because they allowed for preservation of cultural leaders to stay in place.
Great, thank you. Anybody else? No? I can continue, Nigel?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. Some very good contributions there. I'm really pleased that, you know, the 3 or 4 contributions I've heard, you know, are very spot on. You have a good understanding, those of you who contributed, so I commend you in terms of your understanding of indirect rule, its purpose, its objective, and yes, its impact. And certainly, just to consolidate some of the points that you've made, we can say that indirect rule was a sophisticated political system in which the British ruled through the medium of indigenous political systems. So those systems that they found on the ground, they found already there in Africa. The British adapted them, accommodated them, sometimes tweaked them, reinvented them, or preserved them preserved those African chiefs, or sometimes appointed new ones to rule with them, or they ruled with the existing ones, as I think one of you pointed out, the Emir of Kano in northern Nigeria, or the Kabaka of Uganda in East Africa. And it's important for us to understand or to grasp that this system of indirect rule has been associated, and the person or the figure that coined indirect rule was Lord Lugard, who was the governor of Nigeria between 1914 and 1919. He devised this system that was then used and imposed upon the peoples of northern Nigeria through their emir, their religious leader. And that system was then adapted for convenience, pragmatically, on other peoples in other parts of Nigeria, like the southern part that I'll come to shortly, and other colonies in the rest of Africa. And in short, as you've all eloquently pointed out, it was a system that it employed the existing indigenous systems through the traditional rulers to rule African people, to rule through them, to collaborate with them. And yes, I think one of you said, it led to some cultural preservation of, indigenous African systems. Yes, that is true, but it also led to, in some respects, an undermining, a denial, a marginalization, and a destruction of some indigenous systems. So it was a very complex, a very sophisticated system, which was essentially, as I think one of you pointed out, it was essentially a system that was manufactured. It was an architecture, that was put in place to maintain British political domination, to rule, to govern over African people. But with the collaboration, the use of indigenous, traditional leaders. Traditional leaders, were co-opted into this system. So that was, or that is, indirect rule. And it's very important to, appreciate this. The French also used indirect rule, but Michael Crowder points out that the French tended to select chiefs who had shown a loyalty to the French, or French selected chiefs who had obtained some education, whereas the British overall tended to be more careful in selecting chiefs that they considered to be more conservative. And the British, how they operated was that they were careful about selecting chiefs that they did not wish to interfere too much in the way the Emir of Kano or the traditional chiefs ruled, as long as their ways of ruling did not antagonize British interests. They would allow the traditional ruler to continue. Now, Michael Crowder, who also stresses that, quote, but in general, the French system of administration deliberately sapped the traditional powers of the chiefs in the interest of uniformity of administrative systems, not only within individual territories, but throughout the two great federations of West and Equatorial Africa. So indirect rule, as I've said, sometimes did not seek to change indigenous systems as long as they served British rule, as long as they were, achieving the goals and the interests of the British. Where the British did not find chiefs who were compliant, strong enough to rule, what the British did was that they appointed chiefs. For example, in East Africa, in Yoruba land and Eastern Nigeria and elsewhere. And again, Michael Crowder points out that the British system depended on the advisory relationship between the political officer and the native authority, usually a chief, heading a local government unit that corresponded to a pre-colonial political unit. The French system placed the chief in an entirely subordinate role to the political officer. So there's a difference there in terms of the nuance. The British depended on the chiefs, whereas the French tended to see the chief as entirely subordinate. You know, the chiefs would be dictated to by the French colonial governor or the French commandant de cercle. So a very hierarchical system in the French colonial territories, whereas the British were more seen to not wanting to upset or destabilize existing political institutions, but to utilize them for their own ends. And the British relied on the chiefs in the following affairs: construction of roads and railways, similar to the French, for markets, for regulating trade, again, for agriculture, the creation of the cash crop economies that I've mentioned, and also the British relied on the chiefs in regards to local justice. But this was to an extent because in the British colonial administration, cases such as murder tended to be tried by the British colonial court system. However, in some cases, like cases of murder in northern Nigeria, the British would capitulate or surrender and allow the emir to adjudicate in, you know, serious matters such as murder or capital, that required, as the British saw then, you know, capital offences. So to recap or to summarize some of the points I've made so far, European colonial governments or governance structures were superimposed. That is, they were placed on the sophisticated traditional systems of pre-colonial African societies. And as Biney points out, quote, at the Berlin Conference, indigenous constitutions were considered non-existent. So were the numerous pre-colonial societies, along with their centralized and uncentralized political systems. Now, at this point, I want to move on and discuss the historical case of the Aba Women's War, and that's how the Igbo people of southeastern Nigeria saw this Aba Women's War of 1929. However, the British colonial authorities at the time, they characterized it and they called it the Aba riots. And the Aba Women's War or the Aba riots really is a case that it illustrates the undermining of indigenous political and cultural systems in Africa. And it also shows how the voice of women, particularly Igbo women, were ignored, were silenced, were marginalized. Because essentially the Aba Women's War was a very well-organized and it was a successful protest against the colonial power, that is Britain, and Britain's desire to impose, or a perception, rather, I should say, a perception by the Igbo women that Britain was going to impose an unjust taxation on the women of southeastern Nigeria. So what was this war about? It was essentially a revolt by Igbo women who were opposed to the imposition of warrant chiefs, who were rumored to be seeking to introduce a new taxation on women. And as I said, taxation in Africa prior to the coming of Europeans was non-existent, did not exist. This is taxation in terms of money, the monetary system. So the women were opposed to the warrant chiefs who were a creation, an invention of the British in the setting up of a native administration system and warrant courts as well. And the war, or this conflict, was also about the women's sense of moral indignation because of the corruption of some of these chiefs. And also the women were really outraged that their voice, their indigenous cultural traditional systems had been ignored, had been undermined. So it's very important for us to understand that in Igbo society, there was a complementarity of roles and systems between the genders, between men and women. And women had their own traditional institutions, and one of them, it was known as Mikiri. It was a women's association, and it was an association that brought women together to make and decide on cultural and economic rules. Now, one of the major violences of colonialism was that it often reinforced and undermined it, and it entrenched the invisibility of Igbo women and African women generally. Because what this Mikiri institution did was that women in these meetings, the Mikiri meetings, they would make rules about the markets, what goods were sold in the markets, what the times that markets operated. They would make rules around crops and livestock that applied to both men and women. They would hear complaints in the villages about the mistreatment of women by their husbands. They would discuss how to resolve problems with the men as a whole. They would also impose fines for violations of cultural and economic violations. You know, they would impose fines, for example, against husbands and elders if their rules were ignored. And they would do this imposition of fines through the cultural medium of the expression. They would sit on an individual, or they would sit on man, sit on the offender. And what this sitting on an offender or sitting on man involved was that sometimes they would go on strike, sometimes they would refuse to cook, they may refuse to look after children, they may refuse to have sexual relations with husbands. They would put moral pressure on the elder or the elders or the husband by ridiculing them. And they would do this again through the cultural expression of singing songs in which they would sing about the complaint or their protest, their grievance in a song, to put shame, to ridicule, to disgrace the elder or to disgrace the husband. They would dance, and the ultimate sanction of Igbo women was to show moral approbation by going naked, to show utter revulsion by going naked. And sometimes they would bang on his hut with a pestle, or sometimes even destroy the hut of the husband or the elder. So this is what the sitting on man or sitting on an individual would involve. It was a cultural way, a cultural expression of bringing social order, moral pressure on an individual to, you know, reform and conform to the desires or the interests of the women. So how did the British respond to these existing institutions? That is the Mikiri and the ways in which the Igbo people organized themselves socially and particularly within Igbo societies, I've pointed out, a very strong role and presence, contribution of women. In Igbo society too, there was, if you've ever read Things Fall Apart, a wonderful novel by the great Chinua Achebe, he sets out Igbo society prior to the coming of the white man. And Igbo society, as I've pointed out, is structured around this complementarity of roles and economic roles. So men clear the fields and they do hard labor, and they are involved in yam production. And yam is known as the king of the crops. Women's kind of agricultural work is symbolized in terms of like cassava, palm produce, and that's also depicted very, strongly in the novel. So it's a wonderful novel to read generally, introducing you to pre-colonial African society, Igbo society that is, prior to the coming of British colonialism, and what happens to this society with that encounter. So into this very diffuse, fluid, informal leadership structure of Igbo society. Igbo society too, an important point I should make is that it was not a centralized state. It was fluid. It was based on village assemblies. Unlike the Hausas or the Fulani in northern Nigeria, that was a more centralized state with, a traditional leader or the emir, the religious ruler of Kano. Igbo society was totally different. What the British sought to do in southeastern Nigeria was to introduce ideas of a native administration that essentially destroyed the existing village assemblies that existed in Igbo land. These village assemblies that had women and men coming together to, make decision-making about their society. And these ideas of the native administration, the ideas of a warrant chief, these were ideas that the British had taken from northern Nigeria, because it applied indirect rule in northern Nigeria amongst the Hausa and the Fulanis there. And it took this idea and imposed it on southeastern Nigeria and the Igbo people, who were ruled very differently from the Hausas. And so it divided up Igbo land into native court areas and imposed people among the Igbo, that is the British selected people amongst the Igbo, that the British now called warrant chiefs. These were people not elected or chosen by the Igbo themselves. These warrant chiefs selected by the British were now answerable, accountable to the British. And these warrant chiefs were accountable to the district officers who were above them. And then there'd be regional officers and then the governor. So that's the hierarchy. So at the lowest rank of this colonial system is the warrant chiefs in these native administrations. Now, the revolt began because women suffered under the arbitrary rule of these warrant chiefs. They were very aggrieved, disgruntled by the kind of unilateral rule of these warrant chiefs, some of them abusing their positions essentially. And they abused their position, as the women saw it, by taking women to marry without conforming to the customary processes. And part of the customary process was that a woman had a right to refusal if she did not want to get married. So the warrant chiefs were abusing using their positions of power and authority to subvert and to abuse the customary process, particularly in marriage, and and Igbo society was a polygamous society. That is, a man was allowed to have, more than one wife. If you read Things Fall Apart, I think Okonkwo has maybe 2, 3 wives. And this was the polygamous, arrangement amongst the Igbo people. So women were really opposed to the fact that the warrant chiefs were not conforming to these customary processes around marriage. And also they were really aggrieved that the warrant chiefs were helping themselves to the women's agricultural produce, the cassava that the women were in charge of, and palm produce, and their domestic animals. And so in 1929, a zealous assistant district officer, and he was white, in the province of Awari, he sought to tighten up on the census register by recounting households and their domestic animals. And whilst at this point in time, there was no plans to increase taxes on women, there's a typo there, it should be increased taxes on all women, all tax women. Women feared there was insecurities amongst the women that they were going to be taxed. And this rumor or fears essentially spread that taxation was going to be introduced. And in November 1929, one warrant chief entered the compound of a married woman by the name of Nawayerua in order to count her cattle. And she responded to him, "Was your mother counted?" That was her audacious response, because as I've said, tax had never been introduced. So she is asking him, "Was your mother counted?" And essentially matters escalated, and Igbo women in the region, they mobilized, and they mobilized, that is, they organized themselves through the Makiri network that met regularly. And what the women did was that through their gatherings, their meetings in the Makiri, they decided to get rid of the warrant chiefs and the native administration throughout the region, the southeastern part of Nigeria. And so the revolt took place between November and December 1929. And the symbolic targets and actual physical targets rather than symbolic targets were the agents' homes themselves, that is the warrant chiefs, infrastructure of the colonial system, like the native courts, the buildings of the native courts were attacked. Because essentially women were seeking to remove or to get rid of the warrant chiefs as well as the native administration that they felt was, ignoring, marginalizing their interests and their concerns. So, okay. So tens of thousands of Igbo women protested in Calabar and Awari province. And the British were very alarmed and called out troops to, again, stabilize, order, suppressed this revolt and considered it to be a riot. They characterized it as a riot. And I think it's very important that, we look at, what does the word riot mean? What does it suggest? So again, I'll put that out there to you. When you hear the term riot, I think President Ruto in Kenya may have characterized the protests last week as a riot. What does riot suggest or conjure up in the mind when it's used by, the powers that be, when it's used by newspapers? I'm putting that out there to anybody. It's an open question. What does riots suggest? Any hands up?
Feel free.
No?
There's some in the chat.
Okay, I have to go to the chat. Great. Chaos rather than, my God, how far have I got? Violent disorder. Great. Chaos rather than rebellion. Sorry, that's my phone going off. Chaos rather than rebellion, going against the benefits of the collective. Anybody else? Okay,
Unorganized.
that's great. Sorry?
Unorganized.
Sorry, I missed that, Nigel.
Unorganized.
Unorganized, good. Chaos rather than rebellion, going against the benefits of the collective. Not so much. Violent disturbance, yes. Uprising for the voices of the unheard. Okay, yes, that uprising for the voices of the unheard very much reminds me of the definition of Martin Luther King Jr., who said that riots are the language of the unheard in relation to the Watts riots of 1965. Watts in Los Angeles, when African Americans rose up. But anyway, there's some interesting definitions there. But essentially, let me close this now. In politics, the control of language means the control of history. And language is very important. How we name things. How we name things can often distort reality and give power, can give control. In the English dictionary, riot means uncontrolled public disturbance to property and persons. Riot is irrational, so lacking in logic or rationality. I think some things that it echoes some of the things that have been written in the chat. Essentially, riot is something wild, uncontrolled. And when one uses the term riot, it denies legitimacy to the concerns and the interests of the people who are seen to be rioting. It distorts, it silences their grievances. It delegitimizes their demands. It makes their demands, it makes invisible their legitimate concerns. It denigrates them. It ignores them. So hence, when the British refer to it as the Aber riots, it is a term that is, derogatory. It's dismissive. It does not give credibility, recognition, acknowledgement to the legitimate concerns of the women. And in fact, in the colonial literature, the British were absolutely flabbergasted, stunned, shocked, and they believed that the women could not possibly have rioted out of, their own autonomy. The British believed that the women had been set up by the men. It was the men that were orchestrating and had told the women, had organized the women to riot. So, how belittling can that be? And so, therefore, to take back agency, Igbo historians and Nigerian historians have referred to it as the Aba Women's War, that it was a war, it was a legitimate protests, concerns of Igbo women, that because they felt themselves being marginalized, undermined by the colonial system, and they had been, ignored, abused by it. And this was their way to, fight back, to be defiant, to gain some agency, and particularly against those warrant chiefs who they saw as abusing the system. Okay, So the Aba Women's War as a term gives a very different perspective. Because the Igbo women themselves saw themselves as making war on the British colonial apparatus for its marginalization of their legitimate institutions. And making war was their ultimate sanction to enforce their judgments and their interests. So you may ask, what was the outcome of the Aba Women's War? 50 people were killed, that is women, largely women. 50 were wounded. Interestingly enough, there were no fatalities among the British. And what did the British do in the aftermath of these fatalities? The British carried out a very limited administrative reform by dismantling the warrant chief system, which this reform was that they included a few women in local administration as members of the native courts. For example, in the region of Umu Akpo, 3 women were admitted to the native courts. But overall, the broader economic and political colonial landscape remained largely unchanged. You know, Nigeria was not to achieve independence until 3 decades later. So that was the outcome of the Aba Women's War. I see that there's a hand up. Would you like to ask your question or make your contribution?
Yeah, thank you. As we were looking at numbers, like 50 killed, 50 wounded, how many women were taking part of that war? Approximate.
The women led the war. They were the perpetrators.
Yeah, but how many women were involved? This was like
tens of thousands.
Tens of thousands. Okay.
Tens of thousands, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, tens of thousands, yes. You know, Awari provinces, southeastern Nigeria, between November and December 1929. And it's also important to historically situate the Aba Women's War. 1929 globally was the onset of the global economic crisis, the Wall Street crash in October 1929. That led to a fall in global markets of, you know, cash crop and mineral resources on the world markets. And palm oil, which is very important as in industrialization, you know, to make detergents, to make soap, in industries. This was a time of declining, you know, prices for palm produce on the world market. And this was hurting. This was affecting, this was an austerity, an economic depression that impacted on women, Igbo women particularly. All around the world, globally, peasant farmers. That's what these Igbo women, they were peasant farmers. You know, small scale farmers. They were hit severely, catastrophically by the global economic depression during this time. And added to that, there was a rumor that they were going to be taxed when they were already, you know, getting declining income from their agricultural produce, and they were being, you know, seeing the flagrant abuses by these warrant chiefs that were imposed upon them. They had no say in the, you know, native administration system. Their own indigenous political systems, the Makiri, you know, were completely undermined by the British colonial system. Women were not seen. Were not seen by the British. You know, women were to be seen but not heard. The British even had their own attitudes towards their own women, these Victorian patriarchal attitudes, you know, very sexist, very male-dominated ideas that they brought with them, this colonial mindset, they brought with them to Africa, which, you know, completely was at odds with some of the social systems that gave some sense of equity or input from African women in those societies were sidelined, swept aside, ignored by the British. So to reiterate, the Aba Women's War, it illustrates the deep anti-colonial dissatisfaction of Igbo women to the imposed system of colonialism. It illustrates the invisibility of women in the colonial apparatus. Again, I want to reiterate, the African interpreters were all men. The African clerks in the colonial apparatus were all men. The troops, the soldiers were all men. Those who were receiving, you know, missionary education, again, tended to be all men. So in many ways, you know, colonialism sometimes reinforced the patriarchal aspects of many African societies, and it undermined, you know, the power and the status of women within pre-colonial African societies. Now, I've got very little time left. So to recap, the French and the British set up colonial systems that were superimposed on existing traditional systems. African people had their own fully functioning political societies. And as Gebi argues, quote, at the Berlin Conference, indigenous constitutions were considered non-existent. So were the numerous pre-colonial societies, along with their centralized and uncentralized political systems. I think I may have read that quote previously, so forgive me if I have. So the major differences between the French, Portuguese, and British colonial policies is that they were inspired by very different national outlooks based on the differences in, you know, the French national character, the Portuguese national character, or the British national character, and their political traditions. So for example, the British never saw that their colonies in Africa were part of a Britain overseas. You know, Britain believed very clearly in a separate development for the colonies, whereas France considered their colonies as overseas France. So this is a major difference. And again, to reiterate, the French and the Portuguese promoted the very contradictory policies of assimilation and evolution in their colonies, which the British did not. And in contrast, Michael Crowder points out that the British, quote, in the 20s and 30s, actively discouraged the formation of a class of Europeanized Africans, particularly at the level of the central colonial administration. However, whilst, you know, Michael Crowder makes that point that the British actively discouraged, that the flip side or the contradictions of that is that as a result of Africans in the British colonies being exposed to British culture and values and attitudes and language, some Africans did aspire to British values and to the British way of life. No, we can see that to this day in, you know, many former British colonial territories, their court systems, they continue to wear the wigs and the European or the British gowns in court. So that legacy or impact continues in certain sectors, in certain behaviors of Africans in our institutions, in our institutional habits and aspirations. Okay, Sammy, I see your hand is up.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, because I haven't heard anything about the other colonial influence in Africa. I'm from an Italian colony in Africa, so I just wanted, it seems like we're mainly focused on the British and French part of things. I was wondering if there's, if there's any segment, are we just going to skip over, you're just focused on those two?
Yes, I am. I don't have time, you know, in terms of the focus, you know, to look, yes, in terms of Italian, in terms of Eritrea and Ethiopia, no, or even yeah, partly in terms of like Libya. No, don't have time to. I'm doing a very broad brush sweep of in terms of the main colonial powers in Africa. Yeah, I've brushed on the Portuguese. I haven't looked at, or, you know, as I said, Spain only had one colony, Equatorial Guinea. So, you know, to look at all the six powers, major powers of the French, the British, the Portuguese, the Spanish, like I say, the French, the Italians, is beyond the
German.
scope. Sorry, Germany, yes, Togo, German Cameroon, Tanganyika, yes. Yeah.
I'll respond to that very, very briefly. So, Sammy, we do have a couple of upcoming lectures where we would look specifically at Eritrea, Ethiopia, Ethiopia, sorry, and Liberia, called the uncolonized states. So I want to just use that as a way to encourage you to join the course, yeah, because we've opened this to the public, but there will be a point where we don't, and we'll have to close and focus on the students who have registered. But hopefully you've got a sense on how powerful this information is, how important it is in terms of our own interpretation of history, and to use the arguments of the truth from history that we can take and move forward in whatever work we do. So I just wanted to just take this opportunity, not just for you, but for everyone who hasn't registered, to send me an email and do so in the morning. You know, there's loads of benefits to becoming a student. You've got playback. There's other materials as well beside the live lecture that our students are required to go through. And you'll be challenged to think really critically and produce your own material and reflections on the content itself. Yeah, so you would be failed to be transformed by joining a program like this. And plus, we're offering it at a ridiculous price at the moment. So that's my shameless plug for this evening. And I know we're about time's up, but it was a good kind of segue to just encourage you to subscribe.
Yeah. But yeah, you've raised a very interesting question in terms of, but there isn't in the literature Italian, because you know the Italians had small portions of Africa, weren't in Africa as long as the other European powers, the French and the British, who were the major, they had the lion's share of colonial territories. There is very little in terms of books and writings on even, you know, Spanish Equatorial Guinea, or you know, Italian colonies. Very, very little. So yeah, that is a gap. That is an issue. So perhaps it requires, you know, Eritreans, you know, Libyans, you know, to write their own stories in terms of addressing that gap, in terms of the impacts of colonial rule on these territories, to address the imbalance. I was just looking at this book. It's entitled Modern Africa, Social and Political History. And again, Basil Davidson, yeah, his bias is British West Africa, East and Central Africa, Belgian, Portuguese, Spanish, chapter 15, in other empires, Belgian, Portuguese, Spanish. So not even Italy is not, it's got mentioned, Libya and the Maghreb. Yeah. So an interesting question. Okay, let me just conclude. We've got like 5 minutes.
Sammy, did you
Sorry?
Sammy had his hand up again. Did you want to come back with something very quickly, or you talk to me afterwards? All right, no problem.
Okay, so to sum up this lecture, we've looked at some of the differences and similarities, the commonalities of the British and French administrative systems under colonial rule, the existing constitutions, that is the customs and traditions that existed in Africa prior to the coming of the European powers, and how new colonial systems or new constitutions were superimposed on pre-existing traditional systems of government, and how the colonial apparatus undermined, you know, thwarted, subverted these traditional systems. And ultimately, you know, the conquest of Africa severely disrupted African political, economic, social, and cultural systems in profound ways. And the consequences of colonial rule remain in Africa to this day. I thank you for listening.